on behalf of the Institute of Politics. We wanted to, I think this is the last event of the quarter, right? We wanted to finish the quarter by taking a deep dive on national security, because we've been through pretty tumultuous times, and we wanted to get the smartest people we knew on this subject together to give some perspective on where we are and where we're going. And I will not introduce them because we have a distinguished introducer, but all I will say is how grateful I am to have these people here, because together the depth of their experience is unmatched. And so we're really, really grateful to all of them for taking the time to be here and for coming in from out of town. Now, in terms of the introducer, I also get a chance, because we're coming to the end of the quarter, to say how lucky we were to have Patrick Murphy in from Philadelphia, the former congressman. He was a great congressman, and he was a great fellow, and our students learned a lot from having him. And he's going to leave. I think he's going to leave a lasting legacy here, because he's established something for the young people who want to go into the military service. And Patrick was the first Iraq veteran to serve in Congress, so that's a meaningful legacy here. Especially, we believe in service here of all kinds in the IOP. So, Patrick, I just want to thank you for generously sharing your time, and I want to thank your family for sparing him. And you should just know that it was for a good cause. Everyone here so appreciates it. So with that, let me introduce Patrick Murphy.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. It's been great to be here, and it has been an awesome quarter here at the IOP and the University of Chicago. So for those who attended this seminar, you know that we saved the best for last. Today was my wife, Jenny Murphy, who is our guest, about what it's like to be a congressional spouse and to represent one of those swing districts. And we are supposed to be encouraging them, and I think she's up to the task, although it was very realistic about it. So, listen, I got involved in politics because I lost 19 men in my unit when I was a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division. I was an unaffiliated voter. I wasn't a Democrat or Republican. I was a former West Point professor. But when I was there in Iraq, with my second deployment in 03 and 04, and saw what was going on, I knew I was going to get involved in politics, and came back and volunteered for months for John Kerry's campaign, and then ran and won in 2006 in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. So that's why when I saw that this panel was tonight, I delayed my flight until tomorrow, just so I could be here, and said, Axe, I want in, can I do the introduction? And so I'm going to start strong by introducing first Jane Harman. When I served in Congress, I served in 3 committees: Armed Services, Intelligence, and Appropriations. Appropriations was my second term. But I had the honor to serve with Jane Harman on the Intelligence Committee. There is no one in America that knows more about the national security of our country than Jane Harman. She is smart. She works her tail off. She gets it, and she understands the politics of what's going on in Washington. She worked for President Carter. She served on the Armed Services Committee. She served on, as I mentioned, the Intelligence Committee, but she also served on the Homeland Security Committee, which was important because it was just started up in the Congress, became a committee. She was the one that was there. She's now the president and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and as its first female director. And she is a great American. She's a trustee at the Aspen Institute and University of Southern California. One side note about Jane Harman, we both ran the Army 10-miler a few years ago. My favorite story, you know, when I taught at West Point, we have a cadet prayer, and part of it is, the most important part is, to take the harder right over the easier wrong. So Jane and I signed up, we did the Army 10-miler. We had another colleague in Congress that signed up for it. It said to the press she did it and didn't do it. Jane Harman came to me the next day. Can you believe that person? I'm going to go and get in that person's face. I won't say who that was. But Jane doesn't take crap from anybody. And that's why I love her. And Jenny's okay with that because it's, you know, professional love. Next, David Ignatius. This is the first time I met David. In politics, you act like you know everybody. I just have been a fan of David. Obviously, many of us in this room are. David writes twice a week on foreign affairs, obviously, for the Washington Post, and he also writes for the Post-Partisan blog. I didn't know that we both went to the same college. He went to King's College, where I'm a graduate of, although he went to King's College in Cambridge, and I went to King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife and 3 daughters. I do comedy on the side, David, if you didn't know. That's not true. But listen, he's one of the real true voices in our country on these issues, and we're blessed to have him. Let me go to the ambassador. Ambassador, I met him tonight. He has an incredible career. He's now the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He is the former ambassador to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so NATO, which is very important, for more than 4 years. He received and awarded the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service by Secretary Chuck Hagel. And he also served on the National Security Staff as Director for European Affairs from 1995 to 97. He is a widely published author. His most recent book is In the Shadow of the Oval Office, Profiles of the National Security Advisors and the Presidents They Served. He has several other books, but before he was appointed as ambassador to NATO by President Obama in 2009, he was a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institute, specializing in foreign policy, European security, and transatlantic relations. He was educated at Oxford because he couldn't get into King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and Georgetown Universities, and received his PhD in political science from MIT. He's married to Alicia Harris, and they have 2 sons. And last but not least, we have our great moderator, Mark. I was the moderator until you decided to come. Thanks very much. No, I'm just kidding. I just had to give you a rip, guys. Met you too. So he's obviously the White House correspondent. I read him on the New York Times. My favorite part of Mark, and I gave him a hard time when I met him, he started as the copy boy at the New York Times and is now, and I said, hey, I started as a messenger. Now I'm a partner at one of the major law firms in the country. And then the ambassador said, hey, I was a student and now I'm a professor. So we have a lot in common on this panel. But Mark began his career at the Times in 1987 as a copy boy. And from 90 to 95, he was a reporter and editor at Business Week magazine before he rejoined the Times in 1995. He's a 1987 graduate of Georgetown University and was a Reuters Fellow at Oxford University in 1997. With that, we present the best panel of the year, the best for last. This great panel. Mark, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, Patrick, you set the bar too high right off the bat. So I'm going to be very quick at the beginning because I just want to get the 3 of these people speaking. They all have particular interests and expertise that we want to explore with them. The only point I want to make at the outset is it's worth noting that national security and foreign policy is at such a frenetic pace now that you can just take a snapshot and see things that are potentially have far-reaching consequences almost every day of the week. This week alone, Iran carried out airstrikes in the eastern part of Iraq, thrusting itself into the fight against ISIS in a visible way, and one that has all kinds of potentially interesting and troubling implications for the U.S. In Yemen, an affiliate of al-Qaeda is threatening now to execute an American journalist, which takes a page out of the book of ISIS in Syria. The U.S. Just today, the White House confirmed that there was an unsuccessful attempt to rescue this journalist in a commando raid. A couple of weeks ago, the U.S. and Iran agreed to a 7-month extension in nuclear negotiations that, if successful, could be one of President Obama's biggest, if not his biggest, foreign policy legacy. The question that everyone in Washington is asking is how long can the White House hold off hardliners on Capitol Hill, and not just hardliners, a lot of people on Capitol Hill who want to impose sanctions, and perhaps even more importantly, how long can the president of Iran hold off hardliners in Iran who would like to kill the deal? Elsewhere, Vladimir Putin came out in the last couple of days and blamed his seizure of Crimea and aggression in Ukraine on the West, said it's our fault. President Obama spoke yesterday in Washington, said he has no hopes that Putin will moderate his behavior. unless the price of oil craters to such an extent that the economic pressure on Russia outweighs the enormous domestic political dividends he's getting at home by behaving the way he has. And in some good news, and there's not much of it in foreign policy and national security, but one thing that did happen in the last 3 weeks, President Obama went to Asia, and he signed a climate change agreement with the Chinese that actually lives up to the hype that both sides gave it. It's a deal that for the first time ties China to some commitments on when they're going to peak and then decline their greenhouse gas emissions. And most people think that's going to really have a big effect on climate change negotiations next year in Paris. So I just wanted to set the stage to point out that this area, particularly in the last year, I've covered it now for 6 years, just seems to move faster and faster, and every week there are these things that happen that have the effect of really reshaping the landscape. But I thought as an opening question, I would step back from the specific issues which we can then get into to sort of ask a broader question, and that is this. Last August, in the midst of one of these chaotic weeks, President Obama went to a Democratic fundraiser in Rhode Island. And he was asked, as he is at all these fundraisers, about what he makes of a world that's in such crisis. And he said, the world has always been messy. And in fact, I would argue the world today is significantly safer than it was during the Cold War. The difference is that social media, primarily, although not exclusively, has so magnified the threats and made them so immediate and brought them into our lives and homes in ways that it never happened before, that it makes the world seem more chaotic and crazy and dangerous. And so while he agrees that there's a lot going on in the world, he also argues that perhaps we are magnifying the threat somewhat. So I guess as an opening question, I'd like to ask each of you whether you agree with President Obama that in fact the world is safer, not more dangerous, than 3 decades ago. And then regardless of what you think to that question, as you look at the threats the White House, the United States is facing today, what would you identify as the most dangerous one, the most pressing one, and what should the administration do about it? And maybe start with Jane?
Oh, thanks.
Ladies first.
First of all, Patrick, no one has ever said that about me. I'm just so moved by that. Thank you so much. And it was a great pleasure and honor to serve with you in Congress. I mean, one of the things you should know, folks, when you think about Congress as this dismal, toxic swamp which it is that it's the business model that's broken. It's not all the people. And there are exceptional people in both parties in Congress right now. And David just told me a secret. He's writing a good piece, I'm outing him, tomorrow about Mike Rogers, who is the outgoing chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, who is an exceptional person, who has really put the country in bipartisanship ahead of party orthodoxy. So just thought I'd put that out there. I don't agree with President Obama. I agree that social media and the news cycle makes everything seem more intense, but I actually think that in many ways the world is more dangerous. Yes, we've made progress against terror threats in the United States, but if I had to pick one that scares me to death, what do I wake up at 3 a.m. thinking about? It's really not Iran, it's Pakistan. And I think that the potential loose nuke problem in Pakistan getting in the hands of either being sold to some country, and it's fairly common knowledge that if Saudi Arabia decides to have a bomb, it's going to buy one. It may have already paid for it from Pakistan. But loose nukes getting into the hands of terror groups, which Pakistan, at least the intelligence service in Pakistan called the ISI, has kept alive over the years. Loose nukes getting into their hands, and did you read that 6 Taliban commanders have now affiliated with ISIS? So loose nukes getting in the hands of the Taliban, getting in the hands of ISIS, and being used with absolutely no compunctions. Think an organization that, despite what the Quran prescribes and proscribes, beheads people on TV, scares me to death. And I don't think we have enough brain cells on that problem.
Is the world more dangerous than it was? Last night I was at home watching a new BBC drama called The Game about what it was like in the 1970s. when the Cold War was really on. And I turned to my wife and said, "Did you have a fallout shelter?" And she said, "No," but we were remembering how frightened we were as children about the possibility that nuclear war could happen. And if you were growing up in the 50s, early 60s, you really did think that this catastrophic nuclear war, in which, if you didn't have a fallout shelter, you'd wish you did, seemed like a real possibility. Every time I used to hear a siren go off, I'd think, oh my gosh, is that it? So not living under that shadow, you don't know what a big heavy rain cloud that was, and the fact that it's gone, even accounting for loose nukes in Pakistan, is an element for greater safety and stability. What I think President Obama missed in his comment about social media, he's right that social media, this connected world, accelerates information. But I think he didn't think about the way in which that ends up being disorienting. A, disorienting for people, but B, it fosters connections that can be really dangerous. I mean, a connected world where, in Syria, every angry young Sunni who, has seen pictures of people being tortured by the Syrian government can be in touch by cell phone with, thousands of others. And, you magnify that across the Middle East and you have the hashtag revolutions. I mean, that's what they were. So I think this connected world has dangers of its own. And I think the paradox is that it's finding a way as President of the United States to speak through that and be a clear, strong, anchoring leader is something, it's a challenge that I don't think President Obama has been successful at solving. There are many things I admire about his foreign policy, but that one he really has gotten wrong. And the next president, whoever he or she is, needs to think about that. How do you lead a world that's disoriented in this spinning situation? What's the most dangerous thing in the world? I guess I'd say if Vladimir Putin really thinks that belligerent, defiant behavior and recovery of great Russian nationalism by force of arms is an effective strategy, that's really dangerous. I mean, that's the kind of thing that could lead to a war in Europe that could suddenly become really unpredictable. And I guess that I put that at the top of my, as scared as I am about the situation in the Middle East, I put that at the top of my list.
Ivo?
So I think the president is right, but he has the reason wrong. So I agree that today the world and Americans living in this world are safer than they were in the Cold War for the reasons that David mentioned. And the likelihood of something happening to us as an individual or our families because of a foreign policy challenge is pretty darn small compared to what can happen at home on day to day, whether it's a terrorist attack or even a loose nuke getting in the wrong. The likelihood is just smaller than it was perceived to be. But I don't think it's social media that is creating the problem. I think it is the reality that we are much more interconnected with the rest of the world, as David put it. And we as Americans are not really used to this sense of vulnerability by being exposed to the outside world. This is the luckiest country in the world. It has had 2 peaceful neighbors and 2 humongous oceans that have protected us. And the only thing that could do any harm was nuclear weapons and missiles, which is why in the 50s we were worried about it. And now anything can do us harm. Ebola in Liberia can all of a sudden upset a school district in Cleveland. A terrorist attack coming from airplanes in our skies. And you can go on and on and on. It's this sense of vulnerability that we are all of a sudden exposed to these new challenges, new threats that I don't think we have come to grips with. It's also one of the reasons most other countries in the world and most other citizens in the world don't understand it, because they've been vulnerable like this forever. I mean, the United States is the only country in the world that deploys its armed forces for defense, not at its borders, but overseas. What other country in the world has defense forces overseas and not at their borders? We have been extraordinarily lucky. And everyone else knows that they've been vulnerable because they've had borders, they've had neighbors that they couldn't stand or had to fight, and they have been integrated in the global economy in ways that the United States, in the last 20 to 30 years, has become, and that's what's different. And we really haven't had a narrative that allows us to explain how to deal with that. And social media just makes it worse. But it's just it's a manifestation. I agree with both Jane and David. I worry about Pakistan. I think Pakistan is facing a social, economic, political, and security crisis that are existential in all four ways, one of which is enough to destroy the country. All four of it could blow it up. I also agree that what Vladimir Putin is doing is a remarkable, really, truly remarkable change. And if he really believes that the use of force in Europe today is an acceptable way to resolve, to express opinion, you've got a problem. And I worry about China. I do worry that if we don't get the power relationship between China and the United States right, we're in deep trouble. We're in far deeper trouble than what happens in Syria, which is a humanitarian tragedy. But if we don't get that relationship right, and by the way, in history, we've never gotten it right, not just the United States. We've never had a power transition in which the rising power does not challenge the previous or still strong power. That's a challenge. So I think those three are the ones that I worry about. I also worry about, we can get back to it later, that we spend too much time thinking about what's happening in the Middle East while ignoring these other three problems that are really can come and bite us in a way that, frankly, what's happening in the Middle East may not.
Can I quickly then do the Middle East but get past it? Because I think it's very interesting that the three of you, none of the three of you cited ISIS among your list of greatest threats, yet it's clear if you go inside the National Security Council and look at the things that occupy us as journalists and them as policymakers, that ISIS and the military campaign in Iraq and Syria is absorbing a huge amount of time and attention and energy. So I had a couple of questions, and I hope you don't mind, Ivo, but you said something earlier to me that was interesting, which I also want to get to, you said something along the lines of, I worry that President Obama is now unlearning lessons that he learned correctly the first time. But before I do that, I want to ask Jane something, because this is a topic that's now the topic of endless revisionism, I think, in Washington, which is this whole question of, is there a scenario by which we could have averted what happened with the Islamic State? And there's been a number of books published by former very senior officials in the administration who've said, look, if we had just acted more aggressively at the beginning and given weapons to the moderate rebels in Syria, we somehow could have avoided this outcome, or at least increased the odds that we avoided it. I'm interested because you're someone who spent years in the intelligence world, on the Intelligence Committee, speaking to people in the intelligence agencies. If you'd been sitting at the table with President Obama in the summer of 2012 and General Petraeus came in and put this plan down on the table, would you have supported it?
You mean the
aiding the rebels?
The limited bombing of Syria
plus
the
aiding the rebels, yes.
Yes, I would have. But can I just back up and say
Please.
A couple more things? I think the Obama administration has done many things right in foreign policy too, and domestic policy. And I really applaud what the president said today or yesterday, that he's going to try to go for the two big trade agreements, notwithstanding a lot of pushback from his own party. I think trade is one of our best foreign policy tools. I agree with both Ivo and David that we need a much better narrative, but that's part of the narrative. I mean, trade, if done right, lifts all boats, and that's a message we want to send. So I think that's been great. I think what is not so great is the lack of strategy in our foreign policy. It seems tactical. We surge everything into the problem du jour, And ISIL is a big problem du jour, no question. But then we forget about all the rest of the world. And when that happens, oops, then we surge over there. We have to learn how to connect A to B to C, because the world works like that. And messages get sent. You act one way in one problem that sends messages to others. So now, moving to, at least this is my view of this, a few years ago, I think the world thinks we blinked on Syria. And that has hurt us with Russia. It certainly hurt us with Sunni states in the region, the Saudis particularly, who thought we were going to act, and then at the last minute we didn't. And it has created a perception, which may not be fair, that we're weak. And if you're weak in Syria, which is, as you said, or maybe Ivo said, one of you said, not the only big problem and not the biggest problem in the world, then you're going to be weak with the hard problems. And so I think history will not judge that moment kindly. And had we done the limited strike plus the arming of the moderate, again, what are those people, but the more moderate groups in Syria when they were bigger and before ISIL really got a foothold, I don't think ISIL would not be there, because I think this sort of clash of civilizations in the Arab world, which has been festering for, since the 7th century, was going to happen, but I think it would have been much less severe.
Ivo, you said earlier you were worried he was unlearning the lessons. Did you think he had it just about right before the ISIS campaign started?
Yeah, I did. With the notable exception of August 2013, when we had the red lines, we threatened to strike, we didn't strike. I don't think striking would have mattered, but I think from a messaging perspective, it was a terrible mistake. But in the larger context, the original sin was the invasion. That's what created the problem. Plus 7th, 16, 12 centuries of a feud. But that invasion created the problem. And my view, my strong view, is that the seeming Washington consensus, that if only we had armed a bunch of moderate people, which we never were able to find, and we hadn't withdrawn the last 10,000 or 5,000 troops from Iraq, we would have been in a much better situation. I just think it's wrong. It's hard to make the counter argument because we don't have the counterfactuals. But I think the problem is a political one, which is that in neither Iraq nor in Syria today or since 2003 in Iraq and since 2011 in Syria, has there been a political consensus or any way to get a political consensus that's self-sustaining. And I think what President Obama learned, how he ran for office, was that major military intervention by the United States doesn't solve that problem. It doesn't solve it in Iraq. When we spent $6 trillion on Iraq. If you add all the costs, including the healthcare cost that is coming, that's a lot of money. We had hundreds of thousands of troops there for an extended period of time, and we couldn't solve the problem. And the same is true in Afghanistan. And so I think his instinct, and if you look at what he was saying in 11 and 12 and 13, in his interview with Tom Friedman just this summer in the New York Times, was, we're just not very good at doing this. And I think that that's the big post-war lesson. The idea that the United States can social engineer foreign countries that they don't understand by using major military forces is just flawed. And as a result, I worry that we now are going back into, but we have to do something about ISIS, and you see it in Washington. Our strikes are not working. Let's put some more ground troops in, and let's do we've been here before. I think the article that Goldstein and whatever had wrote in the New York Times a few months ago on the op-ed page on Vietnam, a reluctant president getting dragged into something he doesn't want to do. I think we're seeing that picture. And the only hope I have is that the president is strong enough and realizes that that's not the road he wants to go in, and can resist that. That's why I'm worried that he's unlearning the big lesson. The big lesson is don't do this.
I think if no one objects, I'd like to move and surface one or two other topics, and then we can circle back to any of these when we start the Q&A. But I wanted to ask David about the Iran nuclear talks. He wrote an interesting column the other day that sort of talks about what the dynamic is now that we've agreed to put this deal, to keep talking, in effect. And I've heard this analogy that the Iran nuclear talks is turning into the new Middle East peace process. It never leads anywhere, but it never fully collapses either, because it's in everyone's interest to keep the bicycle running. I'm just wondering, David, whether you could give us your sense for, do you think there is light at the end of this tunnel, or are we engaged in some kind of endless process where in the end the supreme leader in Iran will never be able to kind of, come to terms with what he needs to do to get a deal?
Well, I think the useful thing about the negotiations is that they are, I hope, going to be a forcing mechanism to see whether the supreme leader, Khamenei, is prepared to turn a corner. I mean, make no mistake, signing a nuclear deal with a group led by the United States would mark, if not the end of the Iranian Revolution, certainly its diminution. Henry Kissinger likes to say, Iran has to decide whether it's a nation with which you can deal or a cause with which you can't deal. And Khamenei represents this vision of Iran as a revolutionary cause. He's said, I'm not a diplomat, I'm a revolutionary, as a kind of rebuff to his foreign minister and maybe to President Rouhani. If he won't turn that corner and accept that he has a country, and I was in Tehran in December, and I'll just answer your question, finish answering with two snapshots. I mean, the yearning of most Iranians that I encountered in Tehran for escape from this isolation. I mean, Iranians really are proud of their culture. They feel they have an advanced, sophisticated culture, tradition, scientific. The idea that their only friends are China and Russia is appalling, and that's really what got Rouhani elected president. He said, we need to have a wider world. And the supreme leader knows he has to be careful with a country that feels that way. On the other side are Khamenei's friends. I sat down and talked at length with one of them, who say any compromise with the United States would be a mistake, because it would end our revolution. You've been trying to get us to do this now for decades, and it's a trick, and if the supreme leader shouldn't fall for it, and I tell him every day, don't do it. So that's part of what we're going to watch over the next few months, I think, is how that resolves itself. And frankly, unless they're prepared to turn that corner, make concessions they don't want to, accept that they're not a revolutionary state in the same way they were, I don't think we should sign a deal.
And Jane, from your years on the Hill, how would you handicap the whole question of, do we impose sanctions? Your colleagues up there, not just Republicans, a lot of Democrats, more sanctions.
Yeah.
Is that inevitable, and do you think it would blow up the negotiations?
Well, a lot of people thought it would blow up getting the interim deal, and Congress held off on a bipartisan basis. That was impressive that it was bipartisan. I don't think Congress is going to hold off too much longer. A lot of people think that there is no good deal to be had, and that it would be a huge mistake to make a bad deal. I actually agree it would be a mistake to make a bad deal. I maybe, if I weren't an optimist, why would I have served in the United States Congress for 17 years? But I think there is a good deal to be had. And Russia could play a big role in that good deal if it were to be had. I mean, Russia's interests are congruent with our interests in this, because a nuclear Iran threatens Russia, just as an imploded Syria threatens Russia, and Russia's finally understanding that. And maybe Bashar is not, sent by heaven, and maybe there ought to be some different person leading Syria. I'm speaking for Vladimir Putin, but why not?
Good luck.
But I think that Congress for sure, the next Congress, the Republican Congress, will introduce a tougher sanctions bill and possibly vote on that bill in one or both houses. It depends whether that bill has a waiver clause in it. I can imagine the dance being Congress passes the tougher bill on a bipartisan basis. Obama has the option to waive the imposition of stronger sanctions for a period of time, which means it's on him. If this thing crashes, it's his fault, which I think the Republican Party would happily make it. But I would say the chances of a tougher sanctions bill moving through Congress are pretty large. Will that undo everything? I don't know. I mean, what is everything? Is there really something now, momentum for something now that could be an adequate deal from the American perspective?
Well, you raised Vladimir Putin, so let's talk about him quickly. Ivo, I saw something you said to the Chicago Tribune editorial board about Ukraine and Putin, and how the important thing now is to try to make the sanctions bite hard enough that it affects public opinion in Russia, and then thus forcing a change in his behavior. Have you been surprised at how resilient he's proven to be? I mean, the sanctions, by all accounts, have done a lot of damage to the ruble. The Russian government announced the other day we'll probably go into a recession. What's your sense of it? Do you feel like that shift in public sentiment is coming, or has he managed to hold it off? And if so, how much longer can he hold it off?
Well, I think it's only been 7 months. I mean, sanctions working in 7 months that's never going to happen. Now, the oil crisis for Russia, the collapse in the oil price is accelerating the impact of sanctions and the economic pressure. But I think it would take 2 or 3 or 4 years before of real economic pressure, before you would get the kind of internal political change to challenge Putin. And the question that is always out there, is he going to allow 2 or 3 or 4 years of pressure to build up, or is he going to do something that tries to get him out of the box that he's in? And he is in a box because he can't retreat. And yesterday's speech, he made very clear. It was as hardline a speech as the one he gave on March 18th after the annexation of Crimea. On the one hand, he blamed the West. On the other hand, this was a historical part of Russia. I don't know how it is both. But logic is not necessarily part of Mr. Putin's worldview. So he can't retreat. But on the other hand, he understands that if he pushes further, there will be a point at which a response is more likely, and in fact that the sanctions are going to bite more significantly. Tactically, if I were him, I would try to play nice and hope the Europeans fold, which is it's a good thing to bet on. The sanctions need to be reimposed in March, and then in July, and then in August, and then in July by consensus. So if he can wait them out, having the Bulgarians and the Hungarians and the Czechs and the Italians agree on consensus to continue the sanctions, may well be a place for him to start. That's what I would do. I think, because, as Merkel said, he lives in another world, he will likely do something stupid enough to allow the consensus for sanctions to be maintained. And that's, frankly, our only real hope.
I want to just, before I go to questions, one last topic to surface. David, in the taxi over from the airport, was talking about how he felt that Xi Jinping, the relatively new president of China, was maybe the most forceful Chinese leader we've seen in a long, long time, perhaps a generation.
Most effective leader in the world, is what I said.
If that's the case, and one of you said that China was one of the major risks down the road in managing that relationship properly. Do you think that we have got the balance about right with China in terms of working with the Chinese on common interests, but also pushing back on the Chinese when they bully their neighbors, for example? Or do you think that we need to change that balance in some respect?
I'll lead off just briefly. I thought President Obama had a very effective trip to Asia on lots of levels. I was struck in his press conference right after the blowout midterm elections, he looked relieved. He looked like, oh my God, no more elections. I just get to be president now. So I thought he had a really successful trip. Xi Jinping is proving to be, I think, an unusually smart and aggressive leader. I said it to Mark, who really knows Asia, so we should get our moderator to answer this question. But he has identified the real threats to continued Communist Party rule of China. Number one, the corruption of the party and the way in which the society sees it and gets angrier and angrier. And he has gone after, some of the most prominent people in China. Senior military leaders, the head of the public security apparatus. Very tough stuff. Second, the feeling that Chinese people have, you look at the pictures of the unbreathable air in Beijing and Shanghai, this feeling that their environment is toxic. And so I think that's why he made the agreement on the climate change, carbon emissions, is because he's decided as a matter of survival for him and the party, he needs to do something about the environment. I think, we were pushing on an open door. So, I think this strong Xi Jinping also has shown, I said to Mark, I think he decided that he was in too confrontational a mode with Japan over these islands, the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, and so he decided to dial it back and put that issue more in the space. The Chinese are amazing when they decide, let's just defer this one, which is what they've done with Taiwan now for several generations. I think they sort of have begun to do that on this issue. So, I think Obama's basic policy of engagement, how can we work together with this strong Chinese leader is right.
Just a couple of comments. I actually think the strongest leader in the world right now is the Pope. I think there's nobody like him. And he speaks to people everywhere in a way that Xi doesn't. I agree that he's a strong leader. But if you just watch the China-Hong Kong bit, I think that was very ugly. And the Hong Kong protesters distinguished themselves by folding in a graceful way that will preserve some options for them. But China didn't give an inch. And what that said about Chinese rule I thought was very negative. That's a point. But back to President Obama, I think he did have a very successful trip, and I think that the pivot to Asia policy is correct. The word pivot, however, is terrible because it looks like we're moving away from other places, and I don't think that was the intention. The rebalance point, or that's not even a good word, the increased focus in Asia is a really good idea, not as containment for China, but as a way to connect us to the Pacific Rim. We have a huge Pacific coast. How many of you are from California? Please, see, you all know that's not enough of you, but it's the best place to be from. But our
particularly
country,
in winter.
yeah, that too. And it's raining in California finally. But you understand the value of our connection to Asia by population and talent, let alone trade. And so I think that policy made a lot of sense. It was poorly explained, and China took offense. But if we can actually pass TPP, if that could happen, and if over time we can do the good things with China, like climate change, which is in China's interest as well as ours, and we can do mill-to-mill exercises, which we do, I think there's a positive story there, and Xi's leadership will help generate that positive story, which is very good for us and for the world.
Great. Well, why don't I start and go out to the audience for questions? We have like 25 minutes, so let's get right to it. Maybe start with this gentleman in the front row. Sorry to make you walk.
Thank you very much for your time. The point was raised that, there's been this dominance of, the narrative that there's been this focus on the Middle East, and with two very distinguished journalists here, I was wondering, as well as yourselves, that is Western media in general to blame for this preoccupation we seem to have with the Middle East? And by this, so I'm a master's student at the Center for Middle East Studies here, And by this, you look at the example of ISIS, there's no link between the Islamic State and the Quran, the Sunnah, the Hadith. Yet, a lot of Western media portrays this group not as a terrorist group, or not as terrorist groups, but as Islamic terrorist groups. And to me, that intensifies the problem, and it makes it seem as if, every Muslim in the world is a problem and is seeking the annihilation of the West, basically. And I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
Do you want to start?
Just briefly, I wish the Associated Press editors, whose style book people like me and Mark follow, had not decided to accept the Islamic State's definition of itself as the Islamic State, because it does make that link falsely. I think we are preoccupied with the Middle East. It's such a powerful story. I disagree with the other panelists. I mean, I think left unchecked, this group is really dangerous, and it's dangerous most of all to people in the Arab Middle East. I was saying to Mark and Ivo earlier, I really worry that if we'd done nothing, this group was at the border of Jordan, that Jordan, a really important ally of the United States historically, bordering Israel, would have been at risk. And if Jordan's at risk, I really worry that Saudi Arabia could be. So the idea that we could have just done nothing and kind of, we've learned the lesson of Iraq and we're not going to get involved again, I just don't think that's true. But I'll let others answer the rest of that.
I mean, I'll just say briefly, I think, speaking as a newspaper reporter, we tend to go where the assets are, where the commitment is, where the money is, where the administration's time is, and this is where it is. I mean, we have the Fifth Fleet there. We had a major ground invasion there in the last 15 years, and so is there preoccupation? Well, it depends on how you call it. I mean, we had enormous interests and treasury in American lives that were at risk there. So I don't think we actually overinvested in covering that part of the world. The thing I will accept, and I'm not talking about the way we portray the Islamic State. I agree with what David said about that. I think what is fair is the cost of covering that deprives us of resources that we could use to cover other parts of the world. I think a habitually undercovered part of the world is Latin America, which I also think it's probably not getting enough policy attention. But I think there's a lot of stories that we don't cover because of the money it costs us to cover the Middle East. That said, I think that money was unavoidable.
But I would add something else. You asked about the narrative and how this is reported. I think some of the reporting is really sloppy. And the things that ISIS does, and if you have to call it the Islamic State, I don't have to because I'm not a journalist, are anti-Islam. And that point could be made much more clearly in articles. I mean, there's nowhere in the Quran that beheadings are condoned. But it's also the fault of the greater world. I mean, there needs to be a counter-narrative, not just a counter-narrative written in the United States State Department, which has 50 people working on it. That's pretty puny. But where's the rest of the world? Where's the group in the Middle East that is being hurt by this? That needs to push back. And I do understand that some bloggers have courageously put themselves out there. I know some woman, the treatment of women, by the way, talk about anti-Islam is horrific. But some woman blogger put herself out there. They went to her house and they killed her. And women tied to trees and used as spoils for the returning soldiers, and the rest of it is just awful. But the world is not making the counter-narrative as clear as it needs to be. And I assume if that happened, David and Mark would report it. And in fact, David, you wrote, I think it was you wrote about a countering violent extremism group. There is one in the U.S., but there's one in the region.
There's a fabulous one,
which is great.
The world is spending $8 million. You couldn't keep an Apache gunship operating for 3 months on this fabulous countering extremism group, talking about all the issues that we've
and
raised.
And where is it?
And that group? It's called Hedayah. People have to check it out. It's called Hedayah, Hedayah. It's based in Abu Dhabi.
Right.
It's got every major country in the world supporting it. It gets $8 million a year. It's pathetic.
Over here? How about in the very back, the young lady with the glasses and the black cap? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time. And well, my question is, I think few would argue with the statement that the United States is the strongest power in the world, but I think the caveat of being the superpower is when nothing really seems to threaten the United States, everything might seem as a challenge to the United States. So my question would be, how would the United States prioritize its security goals?
You want to start, Ivo?
I mean, I think this is a debate we haven't had. And I think you're exactly, it's the absolute fundamental question. Because I think the United States is the strongest power in the world by far. It is economically, socially, politically, militarily the strongest. But it is a paradox. Our ability to influence what happens in other places is actually going down because power is diffusing. It's a longer discussion, but it's not as clear that just because you're strong, you're willing to use military force, you can then force everybody to do what it is they want to do. I mean, when you ask the question, so what would you like to do in Ukraine? Go to war? The answer, oh no, of course not, but you have to be stronger. What does that really mean? You have to have that discussion. But because we can't influence everything at any time with the power that we have to prioritize. And I think the time has come where the priority has to be first and foremost to make sure that we are together with those countries that are still with us 90 to 95% of the time, if not 100%. The Europeans and our Asian friends. And that we make sure that they are in a situation where their security is protected not only by what we do, but what they do. And I think we have two revisionist powers in the international system today, the Russians and the Chinese. And that revisionism is a fundamental challenge to the order that we have created since 1945. And if we don't manage those challenges, it doesn't matter what happens in the rest of the world, because they will so dominate, they will so succeed in that effort. So it's not that the Middle East isn't important. It's that the Middle East is sucking us in to a degree that we are unable or unwilling to think about the other situations that are out there that are a little bit more subtle, that are not right on the TV screen, that don't involve beheadings of journalists on YouTube, which are a way to entice and mobilize populations, but maybe not in the way that meets our direct interests. So we should have a discussion about those interests, and we haven't had that, frankly, since 9/11, and in some ways not since 1989.
Over here. How about the gentleman with the blue shirt right next to you? Yeah.
In the past couple of years, some of America's allies have been extremely critical of the American Defense Department's and military's operations overseas. For example, last year the Germans denounced American NSA activities, spying on the German parliament. Are these traditional American allies playing politics when they're denouncing American acts overseas, or are they being serious about or are their criticisms serious?
Well, I guess just before I throw that, I just want to clarify. Are you talking mostly about the NSA and the eavesdropping?
No,
or
I'm
more
talking.
broadly about...
I brought that up as an example.
Okay.
But I'm saying, are America's allies, when they're bringing up these criticisms on the international stage, are they being serious, or are they just playing politics?
Jane, do you want to?
Well,
I am interested in the reason I asked about the
Yeah.
eavesdropping is there is this school of thought that says, that it's a little too rich to have the Germans that have their own fairly extensive spy network criticizing us for stuff they do themselves. But I just throw that out there.
But it's I think it's a broader question, and maybe I want to go back to the last question too. I think the way we talk about America's role matters. All of us should now have learned that Jeffersonian democracy is not adaptable to every country on the planet. At least I don't think it is, and I don't think a lot of them want it. And if that's what we think we're doing in the world, the first piece of which is a fair election, I don't think we're ever going to achieve much. I think a little humility would help us be perceived better in the world instead of talking about ourselves as the indispensable nation. That's Madeleine Albright's words, and I think she's marvelous, but I don't agree with that. Or as exceptional. How about trying the indispensable partner? And oh, by the way, Obama's policy in Syria and Iraq is to build a huge coalition. That's what John Allen is doing, General John Allen. And we have 60 countries in. They're not all doing the same things, but the idea of reaching for them, I think, is admirable. So we're the indispensable partner. And how about recognizing that there is exceptionalism all over the world and great leaders? The Pope doesn't happen to be American. In case you missed it. So now going back to this, I think part of this is Casablanca. I'm shocked, and a lot of governments play that card because their publics are upset. And we play that card. Our government does too, from time to time. That's the sort of all politics are local card. I think in the case of surveillance, and I know this wasn't the only thing you asked, the government should not have been shocked. I mean, there has been aggressive spying on countries by other countries forever. The tools haven't been as good as they are now, but they certainly existed. And I'll just say, I think to the extent, if it happened that if somebody was listening to Angela Merkel's cell phone, that was pretty stupid. And there's a cost-benefit ratio that ought to be assessed and adult supervision applied. But there is a growing view of publics around the world, and including in the U.S., that they want privacy from their governments. And most cell phone companies are responding to this, and they're creating products that are more and more encrypted that will prevent government agencies, not just ours, from accessing them. And they're pitching this to publics in Germany, Brazil, and other places as a way to keep back government. And while I'm somewhat sympathetic to that, I would just make a point that there really are bad guys out there. And having the right tools that are used under strict legal limits is probably the better way to go, not just for our government, for others, and probably having an international agreement on what those tools are and how they work is an even better way to go. And we're going to hobble ourselves if what we end up doing is enabling the private sector to come up with tools that keep the government out.
Go back over here. How about the young lady with the purple sweater?
I was curious, when you were talking a little bit about moving forward and progress made with both Iran and China, I wanted to know what you think the balance is with human rights concerns in those countries as well. Do you think bringing them up is a problem in terms of creating a good dialogue and a space to progress and have better diplomatic relations with those countries, or do you think it's an important element that needs to be balanced with the security concerns?
David, do you want to say?
Yeah, just briefly, while I share Jane's view that we have to stop being so messianic about American democracy and the shining city on the hill and we're exceptional, I do think we need to keep faith with people around the world and their aspirations to have the kind of freedoms that Americans have. I watched the Arab Spring ignite and spread, on the ground, and it's turned out so badly. It's such a nightmare now. But it began with an assertion by people who'd lived under police states. I'm a citizen. I have rights. I'm not gonna live under the heel of these governments anymore. And that was righteous, and we need to remember that. I think while we need to be realists, as Jane says, and stop trying to make every country into Switzerland, it is important that the U.S. keep the faith on human rights, precisely because it so infuriates people like Xi or Putin. And if we stop doing that, I think we just sort of strand I want to say billions of people who, if we stop advocating that, who else is going to?
I agree. More questions? This young lady right here in the front.
Following up on the topic of democracy and human rights, from a security standpoint, would the world be safer if more nations are more democratic, especially in the few key players like Iran, Russia, China, or even Pakistan talked about today? Or in light of more recent developments, is it true that in the current state, in certain parts of the world, a stronger, more effective government it provides more security both internally and externally than a more democratic government? Thank you.
So I'm a strong believer that the more democracy, the better. I'm a Kantian. I believe in the idea that if every country is a democracy, we would have a much better world. But then the question is, how do we get to that democracy? And the democracy that is imposed from the outside just doesn't work. But the democracy that grows internally and that maybe is supported through a whole variety of assistance and NGOs and people, that democracy ultimately will be stronger, better, safer, and have more positive consequences. So just to the question of the relationship of human rights and our interests, yes, we should also always stand up for human rights. We should always stand up for democracy. But we have to be realistic that it is up to the people who seek it. We can help. We can be out there. We can make their claims through media and other ways more relevant. But they have to achieve it themselves. And ultimately in the Middle East, that's what it's about. It's about their ability to do this themselves. If we try to impose it, we're not going to succeed. So this is the balance. The balance is to make sure that we know on which side we are on, that we want everyone to succeed in that quest. But it has to be their quest.
But I agree with David that there are universal aspirations. I agree with that. On the other hand, a point I guess I didn't make very well is that if you equate democracy, small d, with an election, it means nothing. I mean, the current government in Egypt would argue they're democratically elected, therefore Egypt has a democracy. Well, oops, not so much. But there is no, there is no US version of democracy that fits everywhere. And for example, one of the big debates now going on, certainly in the Muslim world, is whether if you are a Muslim country and you have a Muslim government, that can also be a democracy. I would say the answer to that is yes, as long as it's tolerant of other faiths. We have a pretty religious government, the origins. Yes, we have separation of church and state, but by and large, our conversation in America over many, many years has had a kind of religious undertone, which we resent in other countries, but we do it here. And Europe doesn't have it in the way that we have it. So I think one size doesn't fit all, but it is better to have universal values apply to all countries, respect for human rights, decency, pluralism, freedom, than not. And if we could just accept a world in which that looks different in various parts, and we partner with the people who have the differences, I think our role would be more successful, and I think the world would be more successful.
There's a gentleman over there in the glasses that's been waiting patiently.
I just would like to thank for this discussion and opportunity to ask the questions. I would like to challenge a panel and ask whether a real threat for our national security is coming from essentially our ignorance. As you said, lack of knowledge, lack of strategy, lack of humility. Because if we are honest with ourselves, the real threat to our national security is domestic inequality, inequality among American citizens, maybe failure of our economy. Those are the real issues that we face. And quite honestly, we did not have one single foreign policy success if we start with Iraq, if we start with Libya, Syria, nowadays Ukraine, the common misunderstanding of those blunders was essentially that at the beginning, if we support a little bit of extremists there, in the end everything will be all right. But it isn't, because extremists always prevail in extreme situations. And essentially we destroyed societies. Iraq is destroyed, Libya is destroyed. Syria is destroyed. What we're doing now in Ukraine is morally dubious. And I ask you, who is responsible for that? How we are going to ask who is responsible for wasting our taxpayers' money and not addressing the real issues that worry people in America?
That's an easy one. Which of you wants it?
I'll start out. First, I don't think that the United States is to blame for all the problems that are around the world. And I want to be, to say that the United States is to blame for what's happening in Syria ignores the extraordinary criminal behavior of that regime towards its own people. I think in Ukraine, the idea that the United States or the West is responsible for the criminal, dastardly, cowardly acts by Mr. Putin and his coterie of kleptocratic oligarchs who are stealing their country blind, I think goes a little far. I did say that I think the original sin was our invasion in Iraq. But that doesn't mean that what was happening in Iraq before or what has happened since does not, the blame lies for the people who are perpetuating those acts. So I think we ought to understand that people are responsible for their actions. It's not Americans who are going around and beheading foreigners, raping women and killing children. It is people who are living in those regions, and they are responsible for what they're doing. It's very easy to blame the United States for the actions that people are taking themselves. I'm not willing to be part of that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be paying more attention at home, but we have to have a balance between what we do at home and what we do abroad. We can't ignore what happens abroad, because what happens abroad comes home to us each and every day. And we need to understand that those two are related. So we need to have a balance, and we need to make priorities, back to the earlier question from the lady in the back, about how we prioritize domestic foreign, and among the foreign, how we prioritize among our foreign engagements. But I don't think we should be beating ourselves up for the fact that the world is a messy place and the United States is to blame. It may be a messy place. I don't think the U.S. is the one to blame.
But I think another part of the question was, are we living our values at home? And that's a valid question. And you look at Ferguson, and you look at New York, and I'm just not talking about police and race relations, and you look at income inequality, and those questions should be asked. You look at Guantanamo Bay Prison, which Obama has been trying to close properly for years, and which Congress is making very hard to do. And if we're going to win, I'm not sure the word win works, but if we're going to defeat the worldwide rise of terror threats against us, the way we're going to win is not with kinetic power, military power. We're going to have to win the argument. And how do we win the argument? We have to have a narrative that projects values that we follow, that will persuade some kid in the boonies of Yemen not to strap on a suicide vest. I think we can do that. I mean, I think we all agree that we can do that. But to do that, we have to pay more attention at home. I think that's what you were asking, to the stories here that are bad stories, and fix them.
Well, it's actually 7:15, and I feel like, in a way, what Jane just said is a very nice way to end this.
Can I just do one?
You want to? Yeah. It's your institute.
Nice try, Mark.
Go for it.
All right, we're out of here.
You run the place.
I just wanted to, central to President Obama's concept was building up of international institutions, building up of international institutions, multilateralism, as an answer to some of these challenges. How have we done in that regard, and what do you think the future is in terms of developing international responses to some of these big challenges?
You know, I think in the first 4 years of NATO, we did a great job.
Since then, it's gone to hell. Yeah, right.
Oh, who was the ambassador? Took a while. Yeah, right. Yes.
No, I think the essence, you're right, the essence of the foreign policy that he ran on and has pursued is the idea of partnerships. And we see that in, as Jane said, we see it with ISIS. I think if we take the response to Putin, I think very smartly the president had decided that he couldn't do this alone. He needed the Europeans to be part of our sanction regime and indeed of the NATO response, and that the only way to get the Europeans to do that is if they were the ones that were seen to be leading. And he worked very closely with Chancellor Merkel to allow the European Union to get its act together, for NATO to get its act together and to move positively forward. We have weak international institutions, which makes it limited the extent to which you can rely on them. But I think, and you see it on climate change. I mean, the idea was that you couldn't move forward on climate change unless you got the Chinese on board, and he got the Chinese on board, and now we have to see how does that translate in Peru in the next couple of weeks, and indeed in Paris at the end of the year, whether that gets a new framework on dealing with global warming. I mean, we are powerful, but we don't have the capacity anymore to do it all ourselves, so we need to work with the institutions we have, and try to strengthen them as best as we can. And I think we've done a good job where we could, but there are, there are limits to how far you can push them.
Final thought, David?
I think one of the best things you can say about Obama's foreign policy is that he understands that America is powerful when it acts with other nations. Mm-hmm. And the period of unilateral American power that was associated with George Bush and our response to 9/11 was a big mistake. Ivo said it was true. So I think the president, that vision is correct. The problem is that the quality of the leadership, the way in which the President of the United States leads this group of nations, frames their vision, sets the strategy, which is crucial to the President's vision, I don't think he's accomplished as well as he needed to. I have to say that honestly to one of his key advisors.
He was good in the first 2 years.
That's good.
All right. On that note, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Ivo. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you all.